An actor plays a man who murders his wife. A few years later, real headlines accuse him of doing the same thing. He swears he's innocent. A jury lets him walk, but Hollywood never forgives him. Davyd Lynch called him one of the greats. Anthony Hopkins studied his work. The industry turned its back on him, and by the time he died, it was like he never existed. His name was Robert Blake. Davyd Lynch doesn't praise actors lightly, but when he talked about Robert Blake, he made it clear. This was a guy he respected. "I saw Robert Blake on The Tonight Show way back when," Lynch said, "and it struck me he did not care one bit about what anybody thought about him, or about his work, or about the business. Nothing. And I thought that was really refreshing." That attitude defined Blake's entire career. It also made him impossible to control. Blake had been famous practically his whole life. One of the last Our Gang stars, he appeared in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre at 14 years old and kept working steadily through the 50s and 60s. But in 1967, he took on a role that changed everything: Perry Smith in Cold Blood. It was a performance people didn't forget. Anthony Hopkins even studied Blake's In Cold Blood performance while preparing for The Silence of the Lambs. Roger Ebert interviewed Blake that year and saw something rare: an actor who didn't play the Hollywood game. He called Blake an original, someone running on pure talent. But Ebert also made a prediction: Blake would either fade into obscurity or become a legend like Rod Steiger. For a moment, it looked like legend status was within reach. But Blake didn't make things easy. He turned down Midnight Cowboy. He turned down The Wild Bunch. He was volatile, unpredictable, and had a reputation for being impossible to work with. Even he admitted it later. "I was an arrogant jerk." And then, in 1997, Davyd Lynch called. Blake hadn't been in a major movie in years, but Lynch wanted him for Lost Highway. And Blake didn't just play the mystery man in Lost Highway. He created him. The pale skin, the shaved eyebrows, the eerie delivery, all his idea. That should have been a comeback. Instead, it was his final role. Because just 4 years later, Blake was back in the headlines. "Every time you think you got it made, old Mother Nature kicks you in the scrotum," Blake once said. His career ended in 2001 when he was arrested for the murder of his wife, Bonnie Lee Bakley. The whole thing played out like something out of a Raymond Chandler novel. Blake and Bakley had a bizarre, toxic relationship. He was her 10th husband, he never really wanted to marry her, and they didn't even live together. She had a history of conning wealthy men, so when they found his wife shot outside a restaurant, Blake became the prime suspect, and there weren't many people left in Hollywood willing to stand by him. The case went to trial. The jury acquitted him, but it didn't matter. A civil court later found him responsible for Bakley's death and ordered him to pay $30 million. It bankrupted him, and Hollywood wanted nothing to do with him. He spent the next 20 years in obscurity, occasionally selling memorabilia, rarely giving interviews, even starting a YouTube channel at one point. He always maintained his innocence. "America was the only family I had," he once said, "and they threw me away." But his past had been catching up with him for a long time. Davyd Lynch once said that Blake had a troubled childhood, and that kind of thing puts people on a bad road. And maybe that was true. Blake himself said most people with his background end up dead. Being locked in the closets and beat up and burned and to come out from under it, it's lovely. Most people like me end up on death row, or in the graveyards, or in prison. Blake died in 2023. 3 days later, the Oscars made a joke about him. He wasn't in the In Memoriam tribute. It was like he never existed. Blake was an Emmy-winning actor. He worked with legends, played unforgettable roles, and left a mark on film history. Even Tarantino, who had no personal connection to him, gave him a nod in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, dedicating the novelization to Blake and other old Hollywood names who had been cast aside. But in the end, Hollywood erased him.